Well, our program today focuses on the Gilded Age, on that era, but it doesn't focus on the beautiful finery and the wealth and the extravagance that we think of when we think about the Gilded Age, because he's going to talk about what was happening with the people who made the Gilded Age possible. So he's talking about our very own Jacob Coxey. I bet lots of you know somewhat about Coxey, but I think we'll learn a lot more. Richard is a Canton native, and he is one of Stark County's most well-known speakers and well-respected historians, and he is the author of 3 books. And he has some books up here for sale, and I'm just saying they're beautifully illustrated. This one kind of focuses on the Russell and Company, so at least the beginning of it will. So you want to take a look at that. And let's see, what else do I want to? Oh, since he retired, he has developed more than 40 programs about Stark County history. So he knows his stuff. Please welcome Richard Haldi.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm curious, because this is Massillon, is there anybody here that possibly might be related to Mr. Coxey? He had 8 children, and you'd think maybe from having 8 children, 2 wives, but the children were here in Massillon. Nobody? Okay. Once in a while, somebody shows up that's distantly related. So anyway, let's begin, because we don't have that much time. As you can see, Mr. Coxey was quite a gentleman. He lived between 1854 and 1951. His home used to be here on 2nd Street, I believe. Is it still here? No. Anything to remind us in Massillon of Mr. Coxey?
A whole bunch of archives upstairs.
But just in the museum, nothing out in the town. If a child, say of 12 years of age, there's nothing out there that would remind him that once upon a time, a very famous man lived here.
There's the Memorial Bridge across Lincoln Way. It's like a walking bridge.
Ah, okay, wonderful, thanks. Okay. And as you see, he was a wealthy businessman, very wealthy in fact, and I'll explain a little bit how that happened, and U.S. presidential candidate. A social activist, and one of the most remarkable features of his personality was he became a religious mystic, and I'll explain that. By happenstance. He hadn't planned it. It's quite interesting. And then a mayor of Massillon. He tried twice, won once only. But before I get into that, I just want to mention, for those of you, because I'll forget by the time the talk is over, to let you know that Massillon is responsible for an era in Stark County that was phenomenal. It started during the Civil War, and just before that, the C.M. Russell Company of Massillon was the beginning of the agricultural industry in Stark County that became the largest, not just in the state or the nation, but in the world for 2 decades. And it all goes back to a man by the name of C.M. Russell and his brothers. And if you're interested in that story, it's one of those books over there. It's quite a story, and we have Massillon and the Russell Company to thank for that whole era. Mr. Jacob, look what, if he was anything, he was perseverance personified. Look at this. He started when he was 31 years old in 1885 to run for the Ohio Senate. And the next time, or the last time he ran, was clear up in 1942 when he was 88 years old. If you can imagine, from 31 and to 88, and each time he lost. Not only did he lose running for the Senate, but he lost for governor twice, then the Senate, then again the House, then the Senate, look all the way down here, and ran for mayor twice, won only once when he was 77 years old. That's when he was mayor, and that was in 1931. And the last time was when he was 87, and that was 1941, just before, I believe, something happened over in Pearl Harbor. So anyhow, look at that. Isn't that something? He was married twice, once between ages 20 to 34, then 46 to 97. He had, 6 children, excuse me, I said 8. And his youngest son's name was Legal Tender. So everything that he was involved with was in that name, wrapped up in the name of his son. That was from his second marriage. And as you see as I go on, this was quite an amazing individual. Just some tidbits about him. How did he become a millionaire? In 1881, his home was he was born and reared in Pennsylvania, and he was looking for a sandstone quarry somewhere, and he found one in Stark County near a town that you maybe have heard of it, Massillon, Ohio. It's right. It's not too. I'm not quite sure where it was. Anybody know, north or south?
Belmont Street, out off of New 21.
Oh, it was south, off of 21.
In 40 Corners Cross. North.
Okay.
And right turn it.
All right. You know where where it was? South off of Erie Street and down that way? No?
North on New 21, you have 40 Corners Road.
Oh, way up to 40 Corners.
Turn right at 40 Corners.
All right.
And next street to the left was Belmont.
This man knows. If you wanted more details, see him afterwards. Okay, thank you. All right, but it brought him into this class of millionaire when there weren't that many like there are today. And what he did was, just like many millionaires of the day, his hobby turned out to be breeding, racing horses. And he did all throughout the United States in different places. And that led to the divorce of his first marriage. But then something exciting happened in 1893, and this is what changed his life and also is responsible for the March on Washington that made him nationally famous. And he met a man by the name of Carl Brown, who would become Coxey's political and religious mentor. And by religious mentor, I mean that he caused Mr. Coxey to give up his Episcopalian background. He was a member here of the Episcopal Church in Massillon, and he became a master in the occult religion called Theosophy. And that's the cornerstone of this March on Washington, because it was called a March for Christ. I'll show you soon. Okay, per his father over in Pennsylvania, he said, "My son is a pig-headed, cranky, and stiff-necked man." And per his sister, "My brother is a family embarrassment." So you can see, in a way, what he was involved with. And so it was a mixed bag of things for his image. And at age 96 in 1950, a journalist asked Mr. Coxey what his secret was for longevity. And he said, taking elixirs. And that was back in the 19th century. You know what an elixir was? It was something that could give you eternal life. So it was not just a physical elixir, but also mental. So elixirs, and number 2, not resisting temptation. You will agree this was a man of not just perseverance, but quite unique qualities in his personality. All right, let's keep going here. From 1894 to 1896, Massillon's Jacob Coxey was more nationally famous than a man from Canton by the name of William McKinley. And McKinley was the governor of Ohio at the time. But we knew about that here in Ohio, but what about California, Texas, Iowa, different places? Everybody knew Jacob Coxey, who he was, what he was about between 94 and 96, towards the turn of the century and afterwards. I grew up during the war years of 1940 with Franklin Roosevelt as president. Did my batteries die?
We talked about that, didn't we?
Yeah, I often have this happen, and I wondered, do people ever check? Anyhow, I'll keep going the best I can, and if you can't hear me, see if you can, maybe batteries are the problem. Here's the official name of the March on Washington. It was called the Army of the Commonweal. Oh.
Try that.
Thank you very much. I think that you can hear now again, right? Okay. The Army of the Commonweal, but it meant Commonwealth, but they dropped the TH, the Commonweal of Christ. And you can see here, it was always a symbol of a wheel, and that was for the good roads. His focus was getting America to get good roads, to get the cars back and the trucks back on the road. And this march left Massillon 130 years ago this month, on the 25th, which would have been last Saturday, I believe, the 130th anniversary. March 25th, that's March, excuse me, we're in May. Anyhow, March 25th, 1894, 130 years ago. He arrived in Washington, which was a 400-mile trek, on Monday, April the 30th, 1894, and that was 37 days later. So you can imagine 37 days by foot on muddy roads that weren't like we know roads to be today or anything like that. It was another time in the season. And his fame, first of all, in 1894, Coxey's Army from Massillon was considered America's most covered news story since the Civil War ended in Appomattox, excluding the assassination of Lincoln, of course, and that was 30 years earlier. So it was that major. The newspapers made him a superstar, truly a superstar at the time. If you were of that age era, you would have grown up with music around you always about Coxey. There were a lot of ditties that people made up. My grandmother used to sing a song when we had a family reunion out in Ink Park over in Canton. She had a little ditty, something about jumping around with the Coxey's Army. Coxey's March on the White House was a famous one, and there were some others like this one here. You can see we are tramps, 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 up the mountain, down the valley, on the plain. We've got Coxey on the brain. Things like that. Bing Crosby even had something that he did about a Coxey ditty at one time. Mr. Coxey was always doing something that would bring attention to him. Here's this, he had his own newspaper at one time published. He printed 600,000 copies, but in his second marriage, as I told you, one of his sons he named Legal Tender. Well, everybody heard about that all over the nation at the time, and that just added to the interest in his personality. Legal Tender. So, what was all of this about? What was the march about? It was America's first major populist protest march on Washington, D.C. It was formed to protest the huge unemployment that resulted from two disastrous national depressions. The Depression of 1873 to 1878, and then 20 years later, the then current Great Depression of 1893. Almost as drastic as the one in 1929. And it lasted from 1894 right up to the turn of the century. And it was, to date, at that time, the worst that America had ever experienced. A number of people out of work and stuff. For example, what he started, the earliest marches in Washington, of course, he started it in 1894, and look what followed his example. You'll know some of these, I'm sure. In 1913, first he had 6,000 that gathered all together in Washington. In 13, there was one, the suffrage of women for 5,000. In 1914, Coxey had his second. A lot of people aren't aware he had two. The first failed, the second almost didn't happen and was more of a failure than the first one. Then in 25, the Ku Klux Klan got on the bandwagon, and they had 300,000 that marched on Washington. And then during the 30s, in 32, there were three, one right after another. And then the rabbis marched with 400 rabbis at one time. And then Martin Luther King in 1957, and the last here in 1963, I Have a Dream march on Washington. But that all started with a man from Massillon, Ohio by the name of Jacob Coxey. To give you some of that background. Some of the cartoons of the era were quite illustrative. For example, this one here, Coxey's March on Washington. There's the Capitol. Here's Mr. Coxey being led by Mr. Brown, which I'll share a little bit with him. 1894, down with the Supreme Court, onward silver syndicate, damn the savings banks, loan associations, life insurance companies, institutions of the gold bug. They were mad as hell. And they were taking on a man by the name of President Cleveland and his ideas. The goal was to get the president and Congress to enact public works legislation and for the unemployment to rebuild America's roads and other infrastructure projects and have them paid in cash, not in anything else, interest or whatever be. It had to be paid in cash. And this was the problem, because the men, before Coxey ever got his march started, you'd see this throughout the United States. We're tired of a system of government that supplies no employment for jobless men. And that was during a depression. You can see the sign up there. That didn't happen just here in Ohio, or in Chicago, but all over. In 1890, 9% of Americans owned 80% of the wealth. Does that sound familiar? Now I think it's 20% own 10% or so. It's nothing new under the sun. And here are the results of that panic of 1893. 25% unemployment in Pennsylvania and here in Ohio, 35% in New York, 43% unemployment in Michigan. 500 banks closed, 15,000 businesses failed, thousands of farms ceased operation. The C. Altman and Company, Canton's largest factory, went bankrupt. Community gardens were established by cities across the nation. Soup kitchens opened nationwide. Starving people did anything to obtain food, and I think you'll find this one shocking. Many American women resorted to prostitution to feed their families. And that's not fabricated, that was the case. And President Cleveland and Democrats were blamed for it. Whoever was in office during something like that gets the full blame. And this is all that led to the William McKinley as president in 1896, which was just 2 years away. And that's, of course, when then William McKinley became so famous, and more so than Mr. Coxey ever did. The major leaders of this are Jacob Coxey, next Carl Brown, and I have him circled because he's really the foundation of what took place, because he convinced Coxey to be what he became. Christopher Jones, he was from the East Coast, bringing people in from New Jersey and Connecticut all along down to Washington to meet the Massillon group from here. And then the news reporters were also a part of the major part that made it so famous. And of course, President Grover Cleveland. And I'll just give you a quick picture of these. Here's Mr. Coxey. And then we're going to see Mr. Coxey and, no, this is Mr. Brown and Christopher Jones. His name was Christopher Columbus Jones, and he brought people in from, like I told you, along the East Coast to meet up with Browns, who was supposed to bring a group in from California, but they got hung up in the Rocky Mountains. And Carl then came to Massillon and went on further. And by the way, I'm just touching the top of a big iceberg of information on this march and on Mr. Coxey. So there's only so much time to share it here. So if you're interested, there's a lot of books available right here at the library up the street on this background. And this is our famous Mr. Grover Cleveland. They used to have to use a big jack and everything to get him into a bathtub. They'd lower him down finally. 400 pounds, I guess, something like that. All right, a little explanation about this Mr. Brown who met up with Mr. Coxey in Chicago. Let me read this to you. Brown's picturesque appearance made him a conspicuous figure wherever he went. Tall, heavy, he was about 6'2", 400 maybe, also huge. With gray hair, he added to the effect by wearing an exaggerated Western costume. It consisted of a buckskin coat with fringes and buttons made of Mexican silver $half. He had high boots, a sombrero, a fur cloak when weather permitted, and around his neck, instead of a collar, a string of amber beads left by his dying wife. And closer inspection revealed the reason why his men called him Old Greasy. It was suggested that he would have been a more pleasant companion if he had bothered to bathe once in a while. So it gives you an idea of what he was. He was quite flamboyant, and he believed in something called theosophy, and he convinced Coxey to give over his Christian philosophy through, similar to the Church of England, the Episcopalian Church, and changed the name of a march that he was wanting to make to Washington to call it the Commonweal of Christ. And they even, you see the arrow down here to a swastika that was used before it became infamous during the Second World War through Hitler's Germany. But that's the symbol they used at the time, swastika. Had a better meaning than what it had during the Nazi era. And for theosophy, they ended up believing the soul returns to earth from heaven after death, and then through many following lifetimes finds perfection. And per Carl Brown, Coxey's friend and religious mentor, every child born has a bit of the reincarnated soul of Christ. And he claimed, he said, I, Mr. Brown, am the cerebellum, and Jacob Coxey is the cerebrum of the reincarnated Christ. And Coxey bought into this, and that's why it was called the Commonweal of Christ. Not what, say, most Christian churches would agree with. But anyhow, this was Coxey, that's the cerebellum, and here, this little part down here was the cerebellum, and that would represent Mr. Brown, the two of them leading this Commonweal of Christ to Washington, D.C. The cerebellum, this part, little part down here, was very important for the cerebrum. It's located at the back of the brain. It's responsible for coordinating movement, balance, and posture. It helps fine-tune motor activities. And additionally, the cerebellum plays a role in learning new motor skills and adapting movements based on sensory input. And that was the role that Mr. Brown played. He changed Mr. Coxey's life enormously, and the whole purpose of the march. Mr. Coxey had a young daughter, and her name was Mary. They called her Mamie for short. And she was 17, she had just turned 17. She was really young, 16 years old, and she led the Washington procession once they got finally to Washington. And she was known as the Goddess of Peace, kind of like Joan of Arc in her white horse and riding down Pennsylvania Avenue on an Arabian horse. And that was in 1894. And guess what? This man who didn't like to bathe too much, he fell in love with her. And at 17, she fell in love with him, and he was pushing 50. And here's their marriage picture. Of all things, if you can imagine, Mr. Coxey, you can imagine, was not too happy. And this is Mr. Coxey. He was 46, almost 47, going on 50. And here is Coxey's daughter, Mamie, 17 years old. The marriage didn't last. I wonder why. And yes, but they had a child. Anyhow, didn't last too long. Okay, let's get into the end of the story. Basically, how much time do I have yet? Okay. And see how this transpired between Massillon and some 30 days later down in Washington, D.C. If you can see the map here, here's Massillon, Ohio, where it all started, in Stark County, and it went from Massillon to Canton, We have pictures of all of these places, of course. Canton, Louisville, Alliance, Salem, East Palestine. That's become famous lately. And then over in Pennsylvania, went to Newcastle along the Ohio River, and Swickley, Allegheny, then into Pittsburgh, on to Uniontown, down towards Maryland, Laurel, Summit, Summerfield, and then in Maryland, Cumberland, Hancock, Williamsport, Rockville, and Washington, D.C. You can see how it dropped down here. Yes, I'm sorry, there's nobody here related to Mr. Coxey. I think that would be fascinating to know what some of the family lore might have been about him too here. Anyhow, join the procession to Washington. Fall in, bring food, feed the marchers. Every little town along this way, just before the army arrived, they would send off people in advance to ask for food and tell them, we're coming, and to keep them from being afraid, because the fear of this army was enormous at the time. The President of the United States, as you'll see, he had called out the reserves to protect the White House. They put it barricades because they didn't know what this army was going to do. This was all whipped up by the media at the time. So anyhow, this is why it took a little longer, because there was a lot of times that the army would stay over in a certain town if they had especially good food. If somebody really helped out and came in, and Grandma brought her best recipes and stuff, and that did happen. Here's some pictures in Pennsylvania. You can see the huge crowds, and the army grew as it went along, because a lot of people in these villages where they stopped, and there were hundreds of villages they went through on the way, would add to the number, and that's why it ended up, what started here was just a few hundred down here on East Main Street in Massillon. It just grew exponentially. And of course, the media followed them all along, and this made headlines every day in the newspapers across the nation. And trouble was brewing for Coxey in Pennsylvania. He ended up being afraid of his army because he feared that he would not be able to feed it, and then people would rebel. But and they were unwieldy and they were hungry. Not only that the tent maker that Mr. Coxey had hired to make tents for them to sleep along the way failed to show up. And they had to sleep in the damp grass overnight, in barnyards and all over the place. No hotels or anything at the time. And he thought that the men would revolt and depose him. And he was cheated by a tent maker. And the officers deserted him. The officers of his army deserted him, and for warm hotels. And you can't blame them when it would go down to almost 32 degrees at night and all the moisture on the ground, and they didn't have blankets, just what they could get from people in the villages along the way. And so it was, and mountain roads were coming after Pittsburgh when you get into the southern part of Pennsylvania and into Maryland, into the mountains. So it was not getting easier for them. But imagine what Mr. Coxey must have been thinking. Here's some pictures actually show how they had to sleep overnight just out in the field. Look how they dressed. They put on their Sunday best for this army, and with hats, and it was the way people were back then. You also, if you see pictures of people going to the Myers Lake Amusement Park at the turn of the century, they had ties on and hats, and they always dressed up. But with the way we are now, we must look slovenly compared to how people thought human beings had to attire themselves back at the turn of the century. Here are the headlines from different newspapers of the area. I tried to combine them. During the time they were in Pennsylvania, on their way to Washington through Maryland. The headlines: Coxey's Folly, Coxey, a candidate for an asylum. Don Quixote, which is Coxey, and Sancho, that was Brown. Cranky Boys at Play, Crazy Coxey Crusade, Troop called out, officials on alert, and they were in Washington. They were prepared for war. They really were. The Treasury being guarded. They put machine guns around the Treasury building in Washington, D.C., afraid of not knowing what might happen when Coxey and his army arrives. blood flows from Coxeyism, and a circus on parade. Those are just some of the daily headlines that were throughout America at that time. Must have been an interesting time. To show you just my memories reminding me here of when you ever got together during the 40s, I can still hear it. I didn't know what it meant, but they would say, we'll have enough food to feed Coxey's army. That was, you remember, you're shaking your head. You remember hearing that? Yeah, sure. It was just part of our vernacular here in Stark County, and I'm sure throughout America at the time. In Washington, President Cleveland convenes a special meeting of his cabinet. This is when they were in Maryland, not too far away from Washington. President discusses armed intervention. Secret Service agents are dispatched to follow Coxey's arrival. A cavalry unit dispatched to intercept the oncoming invasion of the unemployed industrial army. The Treasury building added 55 carbines and 20 sharpshooters to its 70-man security guard. I mean, who knows what was going to happen? Extra protection was added for the president and his family, with staff guard shelters added to the White House grounds. Congress, meanwhile, occupied repealing the McKinley Tariff Act. And that was, of course, all a product. McKinley and his tariff was a product of a man called Cornelius Altman in Canton. Altman was one of McKinley's first campaign managers, and his big focus was tariffs, keep industry safe from imports. And that, of course, McKinley, his buddy, became the tariff czar of America. It was all through Mr. Altman's financial help for getting McKinley elected many times. All right, Coxey's army, forbidden to camp in Washington, sent outside of D.C. to Camp Brightwood after they arrived. And this is a picture showing them going out there. Now, do I have till about 10 of, is that right? Okay, we'll keep going quick here. And here's showing still nothing to sleep in at night. This is the same as in the fields and the barnyards all the way from Massillon through Maryland to Washington, D.C. Not quite what Mr. Coxey was hoping for, if you can imagine, when he left here on East Main Street. Jail yawning for General Coxey. Washington police will put him under lock and key. Careful preparations are being made so that no matter how big the tramp army will be, it will be possible to handle it. And down here, Coxey's advanced cohort was arrested even before he got to Washington. 40 tramps reach Washington and are locked up by the police. That was a first time for a prison attempt. And once they arrived at the Capitol, they never got to the White House or to the Treasury building. How were they going to arrest him? He hadn't done anything? It was just all speculation. Well, they found him walking on the grass. And so keep off the grass. That's what they used to arrest him with. Bad man. Had to go. But it was the only thing legally that they could arrest him on. Okay, here, extra. General Coxey suppressed, hustled from the Capitol steps without a chance for a speech. His chief aides were arrested. Brown and Jones must answer charges of unlawful assemblage. You can see I'm just touching, there's some fabulous stories. That's why if you want to know more, just go to the library and get some of the books. I'll show you one I think is probably the best I would recommend for you getting. Here's Coxey in trespassing on grass. That was the bad man in Washington, D.C. They thought was going to take the money out of the Treasury building. Here's the three of them. That was Coxey and the man Christopher Columbus from on the East Coast. And here's the man who would end up marrying Coxey's 17-year-old daughter, Mr. Brown. And then there was one more, because that was a total failure, of course. And that wasn't enough for him, so in 1914 he duplicated it, and instead of 6,000 people gathering, from the East Coast and elsewhere, and from villages along the way and towns, in 14 there were only 500 altogether. So it was another disappointing run for him. And here's over in Louisville in 1914, Coxey's army in Louisville, and they had a huge gathering there of Stark County people. They thought they could build up some interest in it, but it didn't happen again. And if you're ever over in Louisville, you want to see some of the history, here's the main street. Here's like town square area in Louisville. And if you just go a little east, right over here where you see this red street marked there, that's Coxey Avenue. And that's from the 1914. That's where they bivouacked. That's where they put up their tents in 1914. And there's a street named in honor of him. And then Mr. Coxey, in 1922, after 2 failed marches, had the chutzpah to ask. Coxey tells Congress his vision entitles him to a sum of $40 million from the U.S. And Massillon tells House Committee his plan for establishing a merchant marine would also give railroads money to cut freight rates. Well, you can imagine that didn't take place. $40 million. And this was in the Canton Repository in 1951. He lived till he was 97, just 3 short of 100. And they said Coxey celebrated his 97th birthday, April 14, still fighting for the cause of money at cost without interest, which had gained him national recognition and had given Massillon a place in the sun. And it really did. Most famous man in America for quite a long time. If you can imagine, in the 40s, we were still singing songs about Mr. Coxey. And wonderful to know, though, everything he wanted, everything he dreamed about before he met Brown and got into the theosophy and all of that, happened 40 years later in 1934 through what Franklin Roosevelt created called the New Deal. Everything he wanted with the roads and everything. Look, you remember all these, at the NRA, the 3 Cs, Civilian Conservation Corps, unemployed workers got into that. So Coxey really was the precursor to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. He got everything he wanted through Franklin Roosevelt. And that's basically the tip of the iceberg of a fabulous story that you should look into further as Massillonites especially. But before I end, I just want to tell you what many people believe. During the 1894 March in Washington, Frank Baum, an author, wrote the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It was written and published in 1898, 4 years after, but Baum took part in the march in Washington in 1894. And many believe Baum had hid political meanings in his Oz book. For example, in the novel, his Dorothy, along with the Scarecrow, and the Scarecrow was the American farmer, the Tin Woodman was the industrial worker, and the Cowardly Lion, the political leader, march on the Yellow Brick Road to Oz, the road from Massillon, Ohio to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., demanding relief from the wizard. And who was the wizard? Grover Cleveland. And Dorothy's shoes, of course, in Baum's book were silver, and that represented the silver coinage over the gold standard, but gold being represented by the yellow bricks in Baum's road. But since the shortage of gold is what many believe brought about the Great Depression of 1893. But in the 1939 Garland movie of Oz, Baum's silver shoes were changed to ruby red for the cinematic effect of color. But that's what's believed by many. Now, you look that up and make your own mind about whether that's the case or not, depending which book you read. But it is believed by many. And here's the book I would recommend to you up at the library. And this gentleman here talked. I don't know if he talked here at the museum. Do you remember the talk? He came. The author came to Massillon and was seen by and heard by a lot of people. His name was Jeffrey Prout. You can't recall of him being here, but and he spoke here. Were you here to hear that?
Yes.
Ah,
He recorded it and he came to research several times for the book.
wonderful. Then you have some record of his talk here. He's the man I would recommend if you want to read any book, and there are many on the Coxey era. It's this one right here. And outside of that, remember I have something over here about Massillon's history. If you're interested, stop up and take a look and see. Any thoughts, any comments, and then, yes.
Besides the sandstone quarry at Coxey, there was another, it was called Bull Run. Just
Bull
north-
Run?
Bull Run, quarry. And just north of 40 Corners, it's up
Okay,
221 before Butterbridge crosses. Bull Run.
Okay.
So I don't know who owned it.
okay.
I was born and raised out.
If you want to talk to him about that, see him then and get some more details. Yeah. I saw another hand, yes?
Who were his financial backers? Were there prominent American families that were backing him in this endeavor with their money?
Read the book. No, but he had a lot, he put a lot of his own money in. Mr. Coxey was quite a wealthy man. He got this quarry, sandstone quarry, made it into sand, kernels, and became a millionaire, selling it to the Pittsburgh steel industry. And it was a special fine sand. They needed it in creating steel, yes.
What do you know about his Coxey lax?
His Coxey what?
Coxey lax.
Coxey lax.
He made a laxative.
Coxey what?
Coxey lax. It was a laxative that he.
Oh, you're kidding. A Coxey laxative. Was it to be a mental one or a physical one? Maybe it has something to do with theosophy, and the swastika. I don't know. Amazing. Anybody else? Yes?
Why didn't they travel by railroad?
Why didn't they what?
Travel by railroad.
Oh, it didn't have any meaning that way. You could pay for that. This was walking. And just think, they got all these villages and towns along the way on this long 30-some day walk. No, there was a good reason to walk. It made headlines. Riding on a train, no big deal. I think that's the reason. Okay, I think you need to take it now, right? I'm
Yes.
sorry.
Wow, wasn't he lively and fun? Who knew history could be that much fun? I love it. And when you talked about there's enough food here to feed Coxey's army, that's the way we started every Sunday meal at my grandma's house.
Really?
Every Sunday. She said that before we said the prayer.
I'll be darned.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. This was just delightful. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you at the exhibition, Gilding Northeast Ohio. Don't forget he has his beautifully illustrated books over here and some other information for you. And we'll see you all next month. Thank you.